Yali Madad and welcome to this special presentation from the College Program on Islam as part of a mini-series focused on reclaiming our identity. My name is Mina, and I've served as the program director for CPOI for the last couple of years, and am the program organizer for this special session and series. For those of you who don't know, the College Program on Islam began in the summer of 2002 for Shia Ismaili Muslim youth. The founding program directors responded to concerns coming from these young Ismailis about how to articulate what it means to be Muslim in the United States. Seeking to fill a gap that exists across US universities and colleges, lacking strong Islamic studies programs, CPOI became a place where Ismaili students could come together from around the country, share their experiences, and access rigorous academic study of Islam and Ismaili studies. The overall goals of CPOI have and continue to focus on enabling students to navigate the beauty and challenges in which they are likely to find themselves, living in an environment where one is constantly responding to and working through multiple overlapping contexts, some of which include Shia, Ismaili, Muslim, American, immigrant, first generation, socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on. To increase students' capacity to confidently articulate their identity and to inspire students to think through how to actualize the ethical underpinnings of Islam in their own contexts, CPOI has become a hub for development and growth. Responding to the ongoing global pandemic, the 2020 CPOI program, which would normally have been residential, moved online. That set the precedence and allowed us to bring you this special series, which will focus on demystifying ideas of Orientalism and exoticism that have embattled our faith and cultures, with attention focused on the roots and implications of this othering and the erasure of Eastern contributions to Western modernity within the United States. This particular series and program is meant to provide you with a taste of what some content and conversations CPOI students experience. These presentations are meant to be a place to start and make sense of the complexities of being Muslim in the United States, and we encourage you to use this as a first step to recognizing that these sessions are not exhaustive, but are simply an opportunity to enter into this learning. Today's session, Being Muslim and Tracing Roots with Dr. Edward Curtis, involves discussing diverse histories and the entrance of Islam in America, and helps us identify how deeply embedded Muslims are in the foundation and shaping of the United States that we know today. How long have Muslims really been present in this country? Is Islam really an immigrant faith to the United States? How deeply can we trace our roots to this country as members of the broader Ummah in addition to our own personal movements into this country? Dr. Edward Curtis is a well-esteemed and publicly engaged scholar in Muslim American, African American, and Arab American history and life. He is currently serving as the Millennium Chair of the Liberal Arts College at Indiana University, and Dr. Curtis is a professor of religious studies there. He has authored 11 books and regularly writes for media outlets, and we are very lucky to have him leading this session with us today.
Assalamu alaikum. It is my great pleasure to be with you. So I think about my own identity as a brown boy growing up in rural Southern Illinois without many other Arab Americans around. And I know that it made a difference to me to learn about the past, to learn about my ancestors, not those ancestors necessarily to whom I was related, not even ancestors of my same racial or ethnic or religious background, but people whose experiences, whose ideas, whose cultures somehow resonated with me, somehow made me feel less alone as an American boy in Southern Illinois. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've been so committed to unearthing the stories of our collective Muslim American ancestors, whether we are Muslim or not. They help us reconnect with our true selves, our multiple selves. America has never been a white nation. It didn't begin that way. It didn't continue that way. It's not that way now. Diversity is nothing new. And there are many stories, entangled stories, contradictory stories. These stories are the stories that I want to try to bring to light this evening and also give you a chance to talk about. I want to talk about two kinds of ancestors, two main roots of the story of Muslim America. The first will be the African roots of Muslim America, and the second will be the mostly Asian roots of Muslim America. So let me share my screen with you, and we'll start that. So we're tracing roots. Our collective African roots in this country go back long before there ever was a United States or anyone thought of forming a United States. Of course, the Spanish and the Portuguese were the first in the to come to the New World, and among them were Muslim explorers who were either Moorish or who were connected in some way to the Moors in North Africa and in Andalusia, Islamic Spain. And there weren't that many of them, but one of them was Mustafazamuri, or Esteban the Moor. Estebanico, little Esteban, little Stephen, also in Spanish, who was maybe the first Muslim person to set foot in what today is the United States. He was exploring the American Southwest in 1528. This is no one knows exactly what he looked like, but this is an imagination. And one of the first things you'll see, interestingly, he's claimed as a Black man, he's claimed as an Arab man, he's claimed as a Muslim. He has many different identities, but he was said to have mastered some native languages, Native American languages, which is why you see him depicted with this feather as his headdress. Most of the Muslims who were first in what would become the United States, but was actually the 13 colonies up and down the East Coast of what today is the United States, were actually enslaved Muslims from West Africa, not from North Africa, but from West Africa. And so from the 1700s until slavery was declared illegal by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in 1865, perhaps tens of thousands of these Muslims reached the 13 colonies of the United States. Most of the enslaved Muslims, 10 to 12 million Africans, were enslaved and brought to the Americas. Maybe 10% of them were from an area that had a strong Muslim background, or they had Islamic identity, not an exclusive identity. They would oftentimes practice African traditional religions alongside Muslim practices. But most of those people went to the Caribbean and to South America. Nevertheless, even though there were only tens of thousands in the United States, they made remarkable contributions to the 13 colonies in the US. And one of the places that they really changed the history of the United States is in literature. There's so many firsts. So for example, Henry Louis Gate of Harvard University has called Job bin Solomon, or Ayuba's memoirs, to probably be the first African-American memoir. Ayuba was a highly educated Muslim sheikh. You can tell he's wearing, like many West African Muslims, He's wearing the Quran around his neck. And this is a beautiful portrait of him, actually painted by a white man. And this shows you the high regard with which some educated enslaved Muslims were considered. His bond was actually purchased by James Oglethorpe, the founder of the colony of Georgia, the state of Georgia. And he later returned, after meeting the royal family in Great Britain, he later returned to West Africa as a commercial agent of British economic interests. Okay, the first Arabic language autobiography. You're looking at it here, a page from the folio there in the Arabic, was written by Omar bin Saeed in 1831. He wrote many things in Arabic, but he was a North Carolinian. And his story kind of made a splash in the last couple of years when the Library of Congress acquired this manuscript, and also did some. You'll find on that site a lot more information. But this is very important, because if you used to take U.S. history or the study of the English language, it was figured that enslaved people were illiterate and uneducated. But the discovery of these manuscripts or the rediscovery of them has proven that false. It turns out that enslaved Africans in the Americas were oftentimes among the most educated Americans of their time. They were certainly more educated oftentimes than the people who owned them, people like Omar ibn Said. Of course, he's educated by the fantastic educational institutions of West Africa, right? Like in Timbuktu and Jinne, where you go on, you learn the Quran as a child, you memorize it, and then if you're good at that, you go on and you become an expert in the Sharia. And in that case, all of these, they tended to be men. They were trained in the Maliki school of jurisprudence, or fiqh. There was a royal figure among them. The most famous Muslim of the period before the Civil War in the United States was Prince Abdulrahman Ibrahimo. He went to the White House. He met John Quincy Adams. He was freed from slavery by the Secretary of State of the United States. And he became a very popular abolitionist speaker, speaking in favor of the abolition of slavery. And he didn't get to return to his native country, but he did return to West Africa in 1829 with his wife, Isabella. So his story was important in terms of its sort of literary qualities as well. Then Muhammad Baqaqwa, this biography published in 1854. So this was a very important book before the Civil War, because there was almost no information about what culture and history and life was like around Lake Chad. And this was the first, so this contribution from Muhammad Baqaqwa really educated, or gave, if Americans so wish, it gave them the opportunity to learn about the cultures of that region. Another very important author who was an enslaved Muslim was Sergeant Nicholas Said, or Muhammad Ali Bin Saeed. He was also from Bornu in Central Africa, and he published his autobiography later. He served in the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry during the U.S. Civil War. He spoke multiple languages: Russian, Dutch, several African Arabic, several different African languages, obviously English, and he was very interested in the writings of Swedenborg, who was a Christian mystic of the 1800s. He used to read along with a doctor when he was posted down to the Carolinas during the Civil War. But anyway, he published this important work about his incredible life story. Now, There were enslaved Muslim women, but they were oftentimes not literate, and they instead passed along their culture through food, through rituals, including prayer, through clothing that they passed on. And one of the traditions that the woman whom you see in this picture, who's photographed in the 1930s, her great grandparents were Muslim, and they used to pray, and they would serve these rice cakes, which she called saraka, which probably means sadaqah, because they would do them during a feast day, and they would give them away to the whole village for free, which voluntary contributions are sadaqah in Islamic tradition, right? And so the saraka, these were pounded sweet rice cakes that her grandmother would make. So we learned a lot about these when in this book called Drums and Shadows, which is all about how African traditions continued along the Georgia coastline. And one of the reasons they continued there was because there were it was isolated. There were enough of the people who practiced those practices, they could share them with others and pass them along. And so that's one of the things. And so they changed, how we eat as Americans. And also a lot of their Gullah Geechee language became part of American English, which makes it different from other forms of English. It turns out that a lot of what we consider to be Southern English has a number of African African literary devices. And so even if you've probably heard when people say, instead of saying ask, they say axe. That's from West Africa. Okay, so that's just, you notice I'm trying to go quickly because I want to leave time for some questions and some commentary. So let's talk about the first phase of Muslim roots in this country were African. The second phase were mostly Asian. And this is the second phase, is from after the Civil War in 1880 to World War I. This was the boom period of American immigration. 1.2 million people, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, changed the face of America. America was in its gilded age. It was going through its incredible industrial revolution. This is the age of the robber barons, of the railroads, of incredible booms and busts on Wall Street. And there's lots of money to be made and lots of money to be lost. But one thing that the United States, that these industrialists and capitalists really needed was cheap labor. And so they would advertise. And one of the places they advertised was the Ottoman Empire. So out of all of these people that came out of these 1.2 million, we're talking about a small percentage, but an incredible legacy here. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of Muslims come to the United States at this time. And here's the deal, is sometimes we think of post-1965 immigrants who are favored if they have an educational background, or if the family reunification, we think of them as wealthier sometimes, and indeed they do tend to make more money than the average American, right? That's not these Asian immigrants. These are poor Asian immigrants. And the reason why they are coming is because the Ottoman Empire, right, and South Asia are all going through colonialism, right, and industrialization, which is displacing traditional rural life and traditional ways of doing business, and they simply don't have a way to make money. So they're economically displaced by colonialism and what today we call globalization. Now, most of them come from the Ottoman Empire, okay, but they also come from South Asia and from Eastern Europe. That's why I said mostly Asian. Although interestingly, the Eastern Europeans are Tatars, so you could claim they're Asian too. All right, a lot of these people were peddlers. So here are some early Muslim immigrants, the AOCs, from Ottoman Syria, okay, today, which is Ottoman Syria today includes the countries of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. And so here they are, and you can tell this is before the automobile. They would go in Iowa, and they are peddling whatever people will buy from them. I mean, you name it, what they do is they find out what people want, and then they'll bring that to them. So it can be anything from seed to scarves to needles and thread, you name it. Those are some beautiful draft horses, though, pulling the AOC's wagon through Iowa. Some of these were Bengali Muslim men. And you talk about economic displacement. So how did they get here? Well, they were on British steamships. And in many cases, these were the people who were shoveling coal into those steam engines. And I don't know if you can imagine how hot it was down in the bowels of a steamship, but it was very unpleasant work. And so, you know, I mean, that's not the only reason why you would stop. But if you could see a new life, sometimes you would, when you got into port at New Orleans or New York, you would just say heck with it and get off. Now, it's interesting that in this case, we have several in the this is the early 1900s, again, before World War I. We have examples, oftentimes these Bengalis who were not considered white at the time, they would stay and they would marry black or brown women in Spanish Harlem. And there's a wonderful book about this by Vivek Bald called, and I highly recommend that. Or they would get off in New Orleans, and they actually lived right around Congo Square, which was the heart of Treme, which is this very historic and important neighborhood, as important to the birth of jazz as any neighborhood in America. There was also a series made about it some years ago by David Simon, but this is right around Congo Square, and these Bengali men are living right around Congo Square, marrying women of color generally, and having families, and still raising some of those kids as Muslim. Now, most of these, as I say though, most of the immigrants at the time were Syrian and Lebanese. They're from the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And now these were, remember that Lebanon and Syria have especially Lebanon has a very large Shia population. So a number of these were Shia and Sunni, and they were concentrated in the Midwest. And one of the examples of this would be the Ogdis from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And this is their picture, and they had kids. They were homesteaders. They homesteaded out in western South Dakota and Kadoka. But Mrs. Ogdi said, look, to Mr. Ogdi, I can't take it out here. I mean, you can't imagine how cold it was out there. And the rattlesnakes, she didn't like those either. And so she said, you know, either I'm going back to the old country, or you're moving me to Sioux Falls, which had electricity and, you know, and indoor plumbing, the possibility of indoor plumbing. So he did what was requested, and he moved to Sioux Falls. Now, one of the reasons we don't know a lot about all of these Muslims in the Midwest is because their histories are buried, and I mean they're literally buried. Okay, one reason they're buried is if you look on the left part of the screen, you will see Joe Shami. He is, without a doubt, a Muslim. He was part of the Muslim community in Sioux Falls. He hung out with Muslims. I mean, there is no doubt that he was a Muslim. He was counted. They actually used to count on the state census, not the federal census, the state census. He was registered as a Mohammedan in 1915. That's what the state census in the Dakotas called Muslims. And so, and as did the newspapers. And so this guy, but guess what? He goes and he fights in World War I. He dies during biggest battle, American battle of World War I, the Muz-Argun, and he's buried in the Muz-Argun cemetery. He's buried under a cross. Only Jews were allowed to have non-crosses. Everybody else, no matter what they were in World War I, they got a cross. So to this day, Muslim Joe Shami's body is buried underneath this cross in France. Another way in which these histories are buried, and that's one of the reasons I'm writing a new book on this, is to unearth these histories, is because sometimes Muslims, if they went to isolated places where there weren't other Muslims, they either forgot about their Muslim identity, they didn't want to be known as Muslim because of discrimination, or it just wasn't practical. And some of them may not have liked religion very much either. They may have been modern folk who were very anti-religion. It turns out, as I began researching the Muslim history of the Midwest more and more, that one side of my family was, I believe, likely Muslim. I'm more than 90% sure based on several pieces of evidence. And so this fall, I drove to the boot heel of Missouri, as we call it in my family, Missouri, but my Southern Illinois people called it Missouri. My Arab grandmother said Missouri. I visited John Hemingway, my great-great-grandfather's grave in Kennett, Missouri. And I do believe that this was a Muslim man. That grave marker, by the way, was a Woodman of the World. That was an old insurance company you could buy grave insurance. So anyway, that's John Hemingway from my great-great-grandfather. Now, these Muslims in the Midwest, they did remarkable things. One of the things they built more and established more mosques than any other single ethnic group, both Sunni. And at this time, by the way, Sunnis and Shia are almost, except for in Detroit, are always working together. And they downplay their differences because in many cases, it's their Arabic speaking identity that's more important to them. So the sectarian divide isn't a big deal to them. And they really, and if you ask them about it at the time and later, they said, you're making you're making a big deal out of nothing. We're Muslims and that's it. And so this was the mosque that they built in the 1930s in Ross, North Dakota, where there was an actual Muslim colony of mostly Syrian Lebanese Muslims. And you can't see it, but it's so cold there that you would, half of the building is basically underground because you needed the warmth, so that you didn't freeze when you were doing your sujood there. It must have been pretty cold to pray in the winter there. They did have, various kinds of heaters, but the wind was awful. And then my final slide before we get to, I wanted to mention that the same forces that brought economically displaced people to the upper Midwest, the Dakotas and Minnesota, also brought them to Alberta during what was called the Laurier wheat boom in the history of Canada. And so one of the very first mosques is not built in Toronto, it's not built in, they're built in little places like Lac La Biche. And I don't know if there are any Canadians on this call, but as a Canadian, you may not have even heard of Lac La Biche, but you should look it up. There's still a mosque there. And then also in Edmonton, the Al Rashid Mosque, which has been preserved in a historic preservation place in Edmonton in a park that you can go visit. And so this was the first, and many of the first mosques, they would have added the onion domes and the stars and crescents later. They looked more, they blended into the landscape more oftentimes at the very beginning. But this is an example of how, and this is where our stories entangle, because on the one hand, these poor West Asian immigrants were looking for some kind of opportunity. They really didn't have much at home. And the governments of Canada and the United States offered them the chance to become farmers. But guess whose land they were taking? They may not have even known it, but of course they participated willingly or unwillingly in the dispossession of Native American lands when those lands were taken, when treaties were violated explicitly. With the Lakota, for example, Sioux, though that land was divided up and given to homesteaders, including to Muslims. So this is another, we see how our stories are entangled. It's not all one thing, it's not one thing or another, but when we look back at our past, we see things we admire, we see things that are disturbing. That's all part of reckoning with not just our own unique identities, but our identities as human beings. All right, so now I'm going to stop and begin to take some questions from you, including from our moderators.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you, Dr. Curtis. That was fantastic. And I know it was at least for me, it felt like a whirlwind of information, but I think it speaks to the breadth and the depth of how much there is, and honestly, how much we don't know, and how much is sort of hidden away. So I did have one question come in asking if you could type out the name of the small town of the Muslim mosque in Canada, in Edmonton. We have a Canadian from Montreal on the call who wants to know where they're looking. But one of the questions that came in is, and I think you spoke to it a little bit too, of this sort of disconnect of the different movements. And even though we're sort of tied together under the Muslim identity, there's also sort of a disconnect. And so more specifically, this question is saying, can you speak to or maybe share your perspectives on why there might be a disconnect between, in our case, a predominantly Central Asian and South Asian Muslim community, when compared to or put next to the Black Muslim community, particularly if we really trace our roots back to the Prophet and to some of these more fundamental belief systems. Sort of if there's any thoughts that you could share in the US context and in the American context of maybe sources of that disconnect.
So what the sources of the disconnection between African American Muslim communities and Asian Muslim communities, is that right?
Yeah, in this case.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, one of the things that I didn't talk a lot about, I only got us to World War I and a little bit past with when this pre-World War I generation started building all these mosques, which is really an amazing moment in the history of Islam. Islam becomes institutionalized as an American religion in the 1920s and the 1930s. That is a remarkable fact. And so if you want to know when Islam really became an American religion, depending on what you mean by American, but by American, it means that the religious congregation becomes the center of your ethnic and religious life. It becomes a social network. It becomes, remember that to this day, Americans give more of their money and more of their time to religious congregations than any single other philanthropic activity, by far. Even with the numbers of unaffiliated youth going way up, 18 to 29-year-olds have never been disassociated from religion as much as they are now. Well, maybe back in 1800, but so this is a huge deal. Okay, so that's what I mean by it becomes like, I don't mean that it has a certain American cultural flavor. Look, they were still reciting Arabic poetry, prayers to the Prophet. They were, Maulid, Milad, they were still doing that in the basements of their mosques. They were doing, the Shia among them were constructing Imam Bargas, Husseinias. This is still, still venerating the family of the Prophet. So that stuff went on. It's not that they got rid of that, right? But I mean, as an institution is what it held. Okay, so many of those early leaders did tremendous work to try to bring together Black and Asian people in an anti-colonial movement. And they were pretty successful in many ways. I mean, Muslim Americans, whether they were brown or Black, in the 1940s and the 1950s, were very concerned about colonialism, about the independence of Asian and African states, and these sorts of things. What happened? What really changed was after 1965, as the face of the community changed. First of all, when new immigrants came, they oftentimes did not they wanted to have their own communities, and they didn't want to necessarily integrate into the old communities, or they wanted to take over some of the old communities because they didn't like the practices that were going on there. For example, in Detroit, they would use the mosques, the basement of the mosque, for dances, you know, and people say, whoa, you know, haram, you know, you can't do that. And so they didn't like, so that's just a one simple example. Okay. So they cut themselves off to a certain extent from the institutional memory. I've been doing this for what, 30 years. And one of the things I'm always a little chuckle about is when someone who traces their history to post 65, and they say, this was the first time that such and such ever happened in America. And I'm like, you know what? No, I can tell you it was done in 1923 in Chicago. You know, it's not the first time, you know. So there's a kind of, it takes work to learn about the past. Americans, God bless them, they're a wonderful people, but oftentimes they lack a sense of history. Okay, so so that's the first thing. And second of all, many of the South Asians who came were professionals who moved to, first of all, they came from areas in which there was strong anti-Black racism. Part of the modern world meant the spread of anti-Black science, anthropology, literature, Orientalist literature. I mean, Black people were always a Hegel. Black people were always at the bottom of the civilizational order. So they didn't just learn anti-Black racism when they got here. They already knew it in Gujarat, in Maharashtra. I mean, there's deep and terrible discrimination against Black people, you know, in India and Pakistan, you know, and I mean, they already knew that with the Siddhis and the Habshis, you know, the Makranis, you know, you don't want to hear what people say about the Makranis, you know. And so so they already had anti-Black racism when they come, and then they come here and they try to be respectable white people. And they move to the suburbs. They're isolated. They don't want bad schools. That means Black schools, by the way. They don't want, you know, they want to live in good neighborhoods. That means white neighborhoods. I mean, so basically, I mean, to become an American, unless you're Black, it means to become an anti-Black racist. And in their process of becoming American, there was a real divide between African American Muslims and non. Now, this current generation, just the last 10 years, there has been a real awakening among many younger Muslim Americans who are more intersectional, who are in deep solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, who are not Black. And so there is an attempt to repair the damage that the aunties and the uncles have done. And so, you know, and that's sparked an African, I mean, a renaissance of sorts in terms of interracialism. Okay, I see several. So, but that's part of, it's really, you know, in other words, what I'm saying is it's the story of immigrants becoming white. That's what it's about.
No, and I appreciate that perspective, and I think I at least it resonated for me. And I won't pretend to speak for the audience, but I know it resonated with me, and it makes a lot of sense. There's one, I do want to make a note to the audience very quickly. We've got a couple of questions that I want to remind you there are other sessions coming up, and I'll let you know where you might hear some answers about those once we wrap up, Dr. Curtis, with this Q&A. But one of the questions that kind of came in was, you know, do you have thoughts on the Jefferson Quran and the impact of sort of Islamic thought or some of the philosophies that may have actually been sort of layered into the founding of this nation, the Constitution, where we can look back and say, we were part of that.
Yes, I think that, so it was in conversation with an Orientalist view of Muslim despotism that that American notions of liberty were fashioned. So, in my view, Jefferson was one of the great purveyors of Islamophobia because, he was the one to launch the first war against Muslims in this country, the Barbary War. He got mad at John Adams for wanting to negotiate with the terrorists. And so he went and launched the war. By the way, he ended off paying them off too, $60,000. So what happens is that in the early republic and in antebellum United States is that Muslim despotism is this kind of ideal type against which abolitionism is really, you want to know what it's like to be a slave. Think about those poor white people who are enslaved in the Turkish harems and in North African harems. And this was a very popular form. It's called a captivity narrative. That, and it's also about Native Americans kidnapping white people. Those were really powerful parts of. I know Denise Spellman, she wrote a book about Jefferson and has different ideas, which is great. But that's my read of it. One of the things, if we don't have time to, if I don't have time to share all the books, I'd be happy to suggest some further readings for people who are interested.
Yeah, that'd be great. And for our audience to know, we'll do our best to get all of those resources to you so that you can continue your own sort of inquiry and search into this stuff. I have a little bit of a fun one, and this might be our last one. We might be able to sneak one more in.
Okay.
Participant was asking, what's the most interesting story of an early Muslim that you've learned of?
Well, I probably shared them, of an early Muslim. I don't know. I think Abdulrahman Ibrahimo, Prince Abdulrahman is the most interesting story.
Definitely. It's one that stuck with me, so I'll go with you on that one too. I've heard it.
Okay, yeah.
One I always remember. One last question, and then we'll wrap up, and our CPOI program participants can jump into the next step. But there is a question in here, you were mentioning the peddlers and that they were sort of peddling items. And the attendee wants to know, were these found locally in the US, or were they able to get it from abroad? And really the question that she's getting at is, did they have a connection to sort of the quote unquote back home?
Yes. So this is a case where the West Asian Muslims and Christians would play up their Orientalism, and they would say, these are silks from the Holy Land, and they've been, this is the land where Jesus walked, and also very much people would say that they were healers and fakirs, some of them in New York City or in Chicago. And so there was this whole, what they did was they used the stereotypes of them as a way of trying to earn a living. And so they would definitely, in terms of the stuff that they got, if it couldn't come on the train, out from Chicago, it was, you probably couldn't get it. That was a later time when you could start getting more goods. I mean, I'll tell you, even when I was a young kid in Southern Illinois, there was a lot of stuff we couldn't get, that we can get now on Amazon.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and it resonates with me as well. So thanks for that one. I think we are unfortunately at time. I know I personally found this really, really enlightening and on the one hand, it felt like a crash course, but on the other hand, I think it sparked a lot of ideas. I've seen it in the questions that we're getting as well. I do want to let everyone that's logged on with us know that I did have a question about, Sufism. And that presence in the US and sort of in the sort of Western world. And I invite you to join us tomorrow. We will be having Dr. Shobana Xavier come in and talk with us. And her entire conversation will be about how our faith can actually transmit across space, time, location, and things like that. And she's doing it based on case studies around Sufism. So I invite you to join us there. And there was also a question about the story of Muslim Americans today and how that's sort of shaped by forces around us, be it media, the social influences, constructions, and things like that. And I would invite you to join us on Thursday, if you're Wednesday as well, but definitely Thursday if you're keen on learning more about those particular pieces. Thursday's session will really focus on the last 2 decades of US history and how that's really shaped what we are sort of perceiving and living in as Muslims, as Ismaili Muslims in America. So thank you all for being on. If you look in the chat box, you can see the registration for tomorrow's session. And if you are here as a program participant for CPOI and you've been chatting with us, go ahead and hop over to our meeting room and we'll see you over there in just a second. But Dr. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us. I'm thrilled to have you, and on behalf of everyone that was on, I feel really confident in being able to say that we learned a lot from you and are so grateful for the time that you've given us tonight, especially knowing that it's later on your end as well.
Thank you for having me. It's my honor.